Right, I mean, I think this is an interesting poem because the title says it all really, presents from my aunts in Pakistan, but I suppose it's really about what those presents represent to her and what those presents, you know, the feelings that those presents bring to the surface.
Yeah, I think that the title, Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan, is quite misleading because when you think of a present, you often associate it with positive feelings and you're quite happy to accept these presents. Whereas if you read the poem, she doesn't know how she feels about the present. She feels that she's uncomfortable, she's alien in the sitting room, uncomfortable in the clothes. So it is quite misleading until I think you read the poem.
Yeah, I think that there's all the contrast between all the presents from Pakistan, and she's been brought up in the UK, so she feels very much British. And I think the interesting bit that I like is, and sort of for pupils to relate to, is this idea of fitting in with her friends, and friends not really appreciating those presents as much.
I mean, that's interesting because we just assume it's about being between two cultures, but actually I think it speaks to a wider audience because she does have in that stanza from about line 40 where she's talking about her school friends, so it's about that sort of peer pressure as well and how we all feel that perhaps we don't fit in.
I think it's, yeah, certainly it's a struggle with Moniza Alvi's identity when she was a teenager. Obviously she's writing it retrospectively. She's looking back and remembering how she felt at this time. Not only is she split between the Pakistani and the English culture, but she has got teenage issues as well, like peer pressure from a friend, perhaps, you know, the onset of puberty, relationships. So I think that pupils reading this can relate it to their own situation, even if they're not part of two cultures. I think in terms of the language of this poem, I think one of the things that has always stood out to me is the fact that on receiving these presents and putting on the salwar kameez, that Alvi felt alien in the sitting room. She uses this metaphor to suggest how uncomfortable she feels even in her own home, sort of highlighting the fact that whilst she might be half Pakistani, she doesn't really quite fit.
And in that stanza as well, she talks about being a flame, doesn't she? And that sort of makes us think of her embarrassment, maybe a discomfort because of these clothes, and that she doesn't fit in. But also there's that idea of the, you know, the rebirth of the phoenix. Does it in some way represent her rediscovering part of her identity?
I also think with the I was a flame, obviously the embarrassment factor and the link with the phoenix rising from the flames, but as well her anger. You know, she's not asked to be part of these two cultures and she feels very angry about it, I think, in parts of the poem.
I think for me, in the opening parts of it, is these actual presents that sound very attractive, which you would think that a teenager would be very interested in, the peacock blue kind of colours, the candy striped glass bangles. Those are things that you would imagine a teenager would be, you know, really find quite attractive to wear. But the actual issue that it raises, I think she doesn't always feel comfortable. She doesn't feel comfortable wearing them, which I think is a bit ironic, really, because of how nice they are and how interesting they are.
Yeah,
and the fashion changes as well, so it is a fashionable thing which I think would appeal to her.
She actually makes a statement on line 18 that I could never be as lovely as those clothes, and that they remain radiant but in her wardrobe. So while she appreciates the beauty of them, these exotic presents that are coming from this different culture, she can't actually find that she feels comfortable in them.
And then she's that secret pleasure when she says, admired the mirror, I tried to glimpse myself in the miniature, tried to glimpse myself, tried to see herself in there as part of this culture, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that links back to the idea of the message and her identity and, you know, trying to discover who you are. And, you know, as a teenager, you're constantly trying to reinvent yourself.
I think she's definitely interested in finding out about, I mean, you look at the last bit where she's talking about where she grew up, thinking about her birthplace. So she does want to think about where she's from, thinking where she was born in a culture. I think it's just, again, a teenage thing. She finds it quite hard to come to terms with, maybe because she doesn't feel part of it, because she's not grown up with it, and she can't really remember being born there and growing up.
And I think that part of, sort of, to follow on from the point that you've just made, that she doesn't really know where she feels, on line 67, where she actually says that she is of no fixed nationality, and that always makes me think of the term of no fixed abode that we link to homeless people. And then, you know, this is a negative connotation. She doesn't feel as though she's either English or Pakistani. She's in limbo. She's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. So then that sort of links to Search for My Tongue as well, and perhaps hurricane hits England, where we've both got this sort of loss of identity and clash of cultures.
Yeah, and I think in terms of search my tongue, obviously Alvy's using presents to represent her identity at her clothes, whereas a difference in Search My Tongue is that Sujata actually uses language. So it's the same kind of issue, but they use different things to represent this struggle with her identity.
In terms of structure as well, I think that we've got fractured lines across, so the lines start on the left and then they're in the middle and then on the right as well. And I think that shows, again, the fact she's got two cultures going on, two traditions, and she's torn between the two a little bit. And
is there a line that perhaps illustrates that as well?
Yeah, those conflicts are fractured lines.
I think it's interesting as well that the anthology, that there's two sides of the poem. You know, perhaps that is representing this divide or this confusion with her identity. Maybe it's just done like that for the anthology.
Yeah, but also, I mean, with the stanzas, she sort of starts off with these presents and then reflects on that in the second stanza. And then she's into these memories, and they all seem a little bit mixed up. So she talks about her parents' lamp, that time her mother's jewellery is stolen, which must be a horrendous thing to happen, particularly as it's so valuable to them. And then further back in time, and having to imagine herself through the photographs, because she just can't remember. And I think there's a certain randomness in it that's maybe reflected in some of the other poems where things seem a little bit random or disconnected.
I think one thing that stands out with me in terms of structure is on line 20 and 21, where the poet has used enjambment of "I longed for denim and corduroy." You know, this sense that on line 20 she leaves us with the word long. So we pause a second before we go on to the next line. We really get a sense of this desperation, this desire just to fit in anywhere.
And I think there's other examples where she's highlighting those words through that, like half English on its own, or this idea of in the miniature glass circles. You know, it's all sort of disjointed in a way, a bit like
Yeah, and it then links back to the language feature of no fixed nationality. The poem isn't fixed. The structure, just as she's not fixed in terms of her identity or where she sees herself between these cultures.
Or even as a young person.
Yeah. I think in terms of a personal response, out of the Cluster 2 poems, I really enjoy this. I like the story, the looking back to the past, and all the images that were given. I particularly like the end of the poem, where she says that she's staring through fretwork at the Shalimar Gardens, and it's as though she's saying that there's this barrier in front of her, that she's on the one side, on the English side, trying desperately to access this Pakistani culture, but she's got this barrier in the way, and it sort of leaves me feeling quite upset and quite sad. And I think I'd like to know more about her now that she's older, and maybe how she got over these struggles, and maybe any advice that she could offer young people.
I mean, I think she is addressing people perhaps on different levels about how to deal with who you are. I mean, I always find that line at line sort of 39, the cardigans from Marks and Spencer's, just that contrast, and I think it really does make us think. We assume because we're British that everybody defers to us, and that we see everything else as in some way foreign or different. And yet, obviously, people in other countries see us as foreign and different, and the things we take for granted, they see as perhaps luxury items.
Well, I really like the fact that I think, like most teenagers, there's conflict in her life at that point. I mean, it's a very different conflict to certainly what I went through when I was a teenager, but I can relate to the fact that she was struggling between two types of things. And I really think it's a really interesting poem just to sort of understand how, people who aren't traditionally white British, the kind of things they have to come to terms with maybe when they move over to this country or growing up in this country anyway. I think really quite interesting.
It certainly makes us empathise a lot more.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's one of the poet's intentions, is to make us empathise with situations like this.